The papers trembled in Grace Keller's weathered hands, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of what she was reading. Her daughter-in-law's perfume still lingered in the small kitchen, expensive and cloying, mixing with the scent of the modest pot roast Grace had prepared for Sunday dinner. Through the thin walls of her tiny rental house, she could hear Mrs. Patterson's television next door, a familiar comfort in a moment that felt anything but comfortable. Grace set the documents on her Formica table, the same table she'd eaten at for 3 years, the same table where Margaret had just smiled that sharp, crystalline smile and said, "It's for your own good, Mom. You're getting older, Andrew, and I just want to make sure you're protected." Protected. The word tasted like ash. Hello, dear friends. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we dive into what happened next in Grace's story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Are you listening while you cook dinner, maybe folding laundry, or sneaking a moment of peace before the day catches up with you? Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're new here, or if you've been watching but haven't hit that subscribe button yet, would you do me a favor? Subscribe now. These stories take so much heart to create, and your support means everything. Now, let me tell you about Grace and a mistake her daughter-in-law made when she assumed a small house meant a small life. Grace walked to her bedroom, barely large enough for her twin bed and a single dresser, and opened the bottom drawer. Beneath folded sweaters that had seen better decades, her fingers found the edge of the manila envelope. She didn't open it. Not yet. She knew what was inside. The same things that had been inside for 3 years since Harold died. Since she'd made the decision to live this way. Small, quiet, invisible. Margaret thought she was broke. Margaret thought the peeling linoleum and secondhand furniture meant desperation. Margaret had no idea that Grace had been choosing this life the way someone might choose a disguise. And now Margaret had shown her hand. Grace pressed the envelope back beneath the sweaters and returned to the kitchen. She poured herself tea in a chipped mug, the only kind of mug she owned anymore, and sat down to read the documents more carefully. The language was dense, legal, designed to confuse. But Grace had been a paralegal for 30 years before she retired. She knew exactly what these papers meant. Sign here, and Margaret would control everything. Bank accounts, medical decisions, where Grace lived, what she ate, whether she ever saw her son without supervision. Her son, Andrew. Grace's chest tightened, not with the panic Margaret was counting on, but with a grief so profound it made her close her eyes. When had she lost him? When had the boy who used to bring her dandelions and call them sunshine flowers turned into a man who let his wife corner his mother in her own kitchen, who stood silently in the doorway, refusing to meet Grace's eyes, while Margaret laid out papers and pens and talked about cognitive decline and financial vulnerability? "Mom, we're worried about you," Andrew had finally said, his voice hollow. "This neighborhood isn't safe. This house is falling apart. We just want to help." But it was Margaret who had done all the talking. Margaret, with her designer handbag and her platinum wedding ring, the one that cost more than Grace's annual rent, explaining how they'd found a wonderful facility with activities and 24-hour care. A facility. Grace was 68 years old. She ran 2 miles every morning. She volunteered at the library. She had better knees than people half her age. She didn't need a facility. She needed her son back. But Margaret needed something else entirely. Grace had seen it in the younger woman's eyes during that first dinner after the wedding 2 years ago. The way Margaret's gaze had swept over Grace's modest apartment, the clearance rack dress, the sensible shoes. The way her smile had sharpened into something calculating. Easy prey, those eyes had said. An obstacle that won't be hard to remove. Margaret had started small. Helpful suggestions about Grace's spending. Questions about her savings, her pension, her plans for the future. Offers to help organize her finances, to be added to her accounts just in case of emergency. Grace had declined. Politely. Repeatedly. And now Margaret had stopped asking. The tea had gone cold in Grace's hands. Outside, the sun was setting over the small houses of Maple Street, painting everything gold and amber. Mrs. Patterson's cat wound between the fence posts. Mr. Aiden tended his garden 2 doors down, his back bent, his movements slow and content. This neighborhood that Margaret called unsafe was full of people living quiet, deliberate lives. People who had chosen enough over excess. People who understood that wealth wasn't always meant to be displayed. Grace understood that too, better than Margaret could ever imagine. She looked at the papers again, at the signature line, waiting for her name. At the date, Margaret had written tomorrow's date, confident that Grace would sign quickly, tonight, while she was still shaken and confused. A bitter smile touched Grace's lips. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow, Margaret would call, bright and cheerful, to ask if Grace had had a chance to look over those papers. She'd offer to come by with a notary. She'd bring coffee and pastries, and that smile that never reached her eyes. Grace picked up her phone. Her finger hovered over Andrew's number. "Talk to me," she wanted to say. "Tell me you see what she's doing. Tell me you're still in there somewhere, the boy I raised to be kind." But instead, she opened her contacts and scrolled to a different name. William Fisher, attorney at law. They'd known each other for 40 years. He'd been Harold's college roommate, the best man at their wedding, the one who'd handled Harold's estate with discretion and care, the one who knew everything. Grace typed out a message. She made her move. "Tomorrow, we make ours." The reply came within seconds, about time. "I'll prepare everything." Grace set down her phone and looked around her small kitchen. At the life she'd built here, piece by careful piece. The life that was exactly what she wanted it to be. Margaret thought she was protecting a confused old woman. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who'd been 3 steps ahead since the day they met. What Grace knew, what Margaret was about to learn, would change everything. But first, she had to let her daughter-in-law believe she'd already won. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay in her twin bed, staring at the ceiling where a water stain had formed the shape of a butterfly, and remembered the last conversation she'd had with Harold before the cancer took him. "They'll come for it," he'd whispered, his hand trembling in hers. "When I'm gone, they'll smell blood in the water. Let them come," Grace had said, smoothing his silver hair. "We've been preparing for vultures our whole lives." Harold had smiled at that brilliant smile that had made her fall in love with him 50 years ago in a university library. "You're going to disappear, aren't you?" "After. For a while." "Good." His eyes had grown serious. "Find out who really loves you, Gracie. Not the money. Not what we built. You." She'd kept that promise. For 3 years, she'd lived in this small rental house, driven her 1998 Honda, shopped at thrift stores and watched. Waited to see who would reach out because they missed her, not because they wanted something. The list had been shorter than she'd hoped, but had also been clarifying. Her sister, Diana, called every Sunday. Her book club still met at the library. Mr. Aiden brought her tomatoes from his garden. Mrs. Patterson invited her for tea. These people knew her as Grace, the widow on a fixed income who volunteered and smiled and lived within her means. They liked her anyway. Andrew used to call too, in the beginning. Weekly, then monthly, then only on holidays. And after he married Margaret 18 months ago, the calls had come with a new tone, strained, formal, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. Grace rose before dawn, as she always did. She pulled on her running clothes, worn but functional, and stepped out into the cool morning air. Maple Street was silent except for the songbirds and the distant rumble of the first buses heading downtown. She ran her usual route, past the elementary school, through Riverside Park, along the jogging path where the early light turned the water to liquid gold. Her breathing was steady, her pace measured. 68, and she could still run 5 miles without stopping. Margaret would have been shocked. Margaret, who had suggested during that dinner 2 months ago that Grace might need a walker soon, just to be safe. Grace had just smiled and said nothing. She'd learned decades ago that silence was the most powerful response to assumption. When she returned home, sweating and alive, William Fisher's car was already parked in front of her house. The Mercedes was tasteful, understated, like William himself. He'd been waiting for her, 2 cups of coffee from the good cafe on Morrison Street in his hands. "You're predictable, Grace," he said, handing her one. "You're early, Will," she replied, unlocking her door. Inside, William looked around the small living room with the same expression he'd worn the first time he'd visited, a mixture of amusement and admiration. Still committing to the bit, I see. It's not a bit. I like it here. Grace took a long drink of coffee. Mrs. Patterson brings me cookies. Mr. Aiden teaches me about heirloom vegetables. No one wants anything from me except conversation. Until Margaret. Grace's jaw tightened. Until Margaret. William set his briefcase on the coffee table, a scratched wooden thing Grace had found at a garage sale. From it, he withdrew a thick folder. Let's talk about what you're really dealing with. Grace sat across from him, and for the first time since yesterday, she let herself look tired. Tell me about her, William said gently. Not what you think I need to hear. What you're afraid of. Grace was quiet for a moment. Through the window, she could see the morning sun illuminating her small yard, the flowers she'd planted, the life she'd chosen. I'm afraid I've already lost my son, she finally said. That's what I'm afraid of. William nodded slowly. Tell me about Andrew. The real Andrew. The memories came like photographs, flipping through Grace's mind. Andrew at 7, bringing home a stray dog and begging to keep it. Andrew at 15, working 2 jobs to save for college, even though Grace and Harold could have paid for it 10 times over. Andrew at 23, graduating medical school, crying as he thanked them for believing in him. He was kind, Grace said quietly. He used to volunteer at the free clinic every Saturday. He'd come home exhausted, but he'd say, Mom, I helped someone today who had no one else. He cared about people, not things. And now, Grace's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Now he works at Margaret's father's private practice in the richest part of the city. He drives a car that costs more than most people make in 2 years. He wears watches I don't recognize and talks about investment properties. She looked at William. He's become someone I don't know. Or someone he thinks he's supposed to be, William suggested. Maybe. But he stood in my kitchen yesterday and let his wife try to take away my autonomy. He didn't defend me. He barely looked at me. Grace's voice cracked. That's not the boy I raised. William pulled out another document. Let's talk about what Margaret knows versus what she thinks she knows. Grace leaned forward. She knows Harold died 3 years ago. She knows you worked as a paralegal. She knows you receive a modest pension and Social Security. She sees this house, your car, your clothes. She's drawn conclusions. All the conclusions I wanted her to draw, Grace said. Exactly. But here's what's interesting. William slid a paper toward her. Margaret has been making inquiries. She contacted the county clerk's office 2 months ago, requesting records of any property under your name. She found nothing because everything is in trust. She called 3 banks trying to locate your accounts. She came up empty because our friend Judge Patricia moved everything into secured channels after Harold passed. Grace felt a chill. She's been investigating me for at least 6 months. She's thorough, I'll give her that. William pulled out more papers. She also petitioned for access to Harold's death certificate and probate records. She's building a case that you're either destitute or hiding assets. Either way, she believes you're vulnerable. How did I not know this? Because she's good at what she does. William's expression was grim. Grace, I need you to understand what we're dealing with. This isn't just a greedy daughter-in-law. Margaret has done this before. The room went very quiet. What do you mean? Grace asked. William pulled out a background report. After you called me 2 years ago, when Andrew first introduced her, I did some digging. Margaret's maiden name is Rothman, but she was born Margaret Santos. Changed it legally when she was 24. Her first marriage was to a man named Richard Rothman, 72 years old, a retired executive. He died 8 months after they married. Grace's blood ran cold. Natural causes, William continued. Heart attack. But before he died, he'd signed over power of attorney to Margaret. She inherited everything, about $4 million. His children from his first marriage contested the will, but Margaret had documentation showing Richard was in cognitive decline and she was his primary caretaker. Oh my God, it gets worse. Before Richard, she was engaged to another elderly man, Samuel Pritchard. That engagement ended when Samuel's daughter intervened and threatened legal action. Margaret walked away with a gift of $200,000 to avoid scandal. Grace stood up. her legs unsteady. Andrew has no idea. I suspect Andrew knows what she's told him, that she's a widow who lost her first husband tragically. She probably painted herself as a victim. And my son, the doctor, the healer, wanted to save her. Grace pressed her palms against her eyes. He walked right into it. She's good at what she does, William repeated. She finds successful, kind-hearted men and becomes exactly what they need. With Andrew, she became the wounded bird. Beautiful, cultured, but fragile from loss. Your son's a doctor. His instinct is to heal. Grace thought about the wedding, how Margaret had cried delicate tears during the vows, how she talked about being so grateful to finally have a real family again, how Andrew had looked at her like she was made of spun glass. It had all been performance. Why didn't you tell me this before? Grace asked. Because you told me not to. William's voice was gentle. You said you want to see how things developed naturally. You said if Andrew was truly happy, the money didn't matter. You wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. He was right. She had said that. She'd hoped, desperately, that she was wrong about Margaret, that her instincts were just those of an overprotective mother who didn't want to share her only son. But instincts honed over 68 years were rarely wrong. The paper she gave me yesterday, Grace said, the power of attorney. If I'd signed them, she'd have access to everything within a week. And once she discovered the trusts, the investments, the real estate holdings, William paused. Harold's estate was valued at $47 million, Grace. The investments have grown. You're worth approximately $63 million now. The number still shocked her, even though she'd seen the quarterly statements. Harold's patents, his investments, the technology company he'd built from nothing and sold at exactly the right moment. It had all been worth more than they'd ever needed. So they'd lived well, but not lavishly, and they'd planned to give most of it away. To scholarships, to medical research, to the causes they believed in. Grace had been working with William to set it all up when Harold got sick. Then after he died, she needed time. Time to grieve. Time to think. Time to understand who she was without the man she'd loved for 50 years. Time to see who her son really was. If Margaret gets control, Grace said quietly, she'll take everything. And Andrew, her voice broke. He'll lose himself completely. He'll become her accomplice, maybe even believing he's doing the right thing. That's what terrifies me most. William stood and put a hand on her shoulder. Then we don't let that happen. You asked me 3 years ago to help you disappear. Now I'm asking, are you ready to reappear? Grace looked around her small living room, at the life that had been real and simple and true, at the peace she'd found in anonymity. Then she thought about her son, about the boy who'd brought her sunshine flowers, about the man he could still become if someone loved him enough to fight for him. Yes, she said, I'm ready. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to fight for someone you loved, even when they couldn't see they needed fighting for? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one, and sometimes your experiences help others feel less alone. Now, let's talk about what Grace and William planned next, and how badly Margaret had miscalculated. Margaret called at exactly 9 o'clock Monday morning, just as Grace had predicted. Good morning, Mom. The voice was bright, musical, poisonously cheerful. I hope I didn't wake you. Grace stood in her kitchen, phone on speaker, while William sat across from her with a recording device running. They'd been ready since 8. I've been up since 5, dear, Grace said, keeping her voice steady. You know I'm an early riser. Of course, of course. A pause. I was just calling to see if you'd had a chance to look over those documents we left yesterday. I know legal paperwork can be so confusing at any age. Our age. Margaret was 34. I looked at them, Grace said carefully. Wonderful. I'm so glad. I can come by this afternoon with a notary. I know a lovely woman who can fit us in it too. We can get everything signed and filed, and then you won't have to worry about a thing. Andrew and I will handle everything. Grace caught William's eye. He nodded. Actually, Margaret, I have some questions about the documents. Perhaps we could meet somewhere to discuss them? I'd feel more comfortable going over the details in person. The briefest hesitation. Of course, Mom. Whatever makes you comfortable. Why don't Andrew and I come to you? Say around noon. Actually, I prefer neutral ground. How about the Riverside Cafe? 1 o'clock. Another pause, longer this time. Grace could almost hear the calculations happening on the other end of the line. The Riverside Cafe, Margaret repeated slowly. That's quite a drive for you, isn't it? I'm not sure your car is reliable enough for. I'll manage, Grace said firmly. 1 o'clock. I'll see you both there. She hung up before Margaret could object. William stopped the recording. She's going to come prepared. You know that, right? I'm counting on it, Grace said. The Riverside Cafe was one of those places that tried too hard. White tablecloths, prix-fixe menus, a wine list thicker than most books. It was exactly the kind of place Margaret would feel comfortable and Grace would seem out of place. Grace arrived at 12:45, wearing the same clearance rack dress she'd worn to Sunday dinner. She'd driven her ancient Honda and parked it between a Tesla and a Porsche, where it sat like a rusty accusation. She chose a table by the window and ordered water. Margaret and Andrew arrived at 1 sharp, and Grace felt her heart crack at the sight of her son. He looked tired. No, exhaustive. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago, and his smile, when he saw her, didn't reach those eyes at all. Mom! He kissed her cheek, and for just a moment, she caught a flash of the boy he'd been. Then Margaret's hand was on his arm, and he straightened, the mask sliding back into place. Grace, you look well, Margaret said, settling into her chair with practiced elegance. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost what Grace paid in rent for 6 months. Her jewelry was understated, but unmistakably real. This is a lovely choice. I'm so glad you felt up to the drive. The waiter appeared. Margaret ordered a salad and sparkling water. Andrew ordered the same, though Grace remembered he used to love a good burger. Grace ordered coffee and nothing else. Not hungry, Mom? Andrew asked, concern flickering across his face. I ate before I came, Grace lied. I want to make sure we had time to talk about these papers. Margaret's smile brightened. Of course. That's why we're here. She pulled a leather folder from her designer bag. I brought extra copies just in case. And I took the liberty of calling that notary. She's actually having lunch here too, completely coincidentally. She said she could spare 10 minutes if we need her. Nothing Margaret did was coincidental. Grace pulled out her own copies of the documents, now marked with highlighter and sticky notes. I have several concerns. Margaret's smile flickered. Concerns? The power of attorney is very broad. It would give you control over my medical decisions, my finances, where I live, who I see. That seems extensive. It's standard, Mom, Margaret said smoothly. It's just to make sure that if something happens, Andrew and I can take care of you without bureaucratic delays. You'd want that, wouldn't you? To know someone's looking out for you. Grace looked at her son. Andrew, you're a doctor. Do you think I need this level of oversight? Andrew opened his mouth, and for a second, Grace saw real conflict in his eyes. Then Margaret's hand covered his on the table. Andrew's been worried sick about you, Margaret said before he could answer. Haven't you, honey? Mom, that neighborhood you're in. Andrew's voice was strained. It's not safe, and the house is so small, and you're all alone. I like being alone, Grace said quietly. I like my neighbors. I like my life. But you're struggling, Margaret interjected. We can see it. The car that barely runs, the clothes, that tiny house. You're too proud to ask for help. But Mom, she leaned forward, her expression earnest, perfect. It's okay to need help. It's okay to let us support you. Support me, Grace repeated. Or control me. The air at the table went cold. Margaret's smile never wavered, but something sharp glinted in her eyes. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. The conservatorship papers, the ones on page 7, they would designate me as unable to manage my own affairs. They would require a doctor to declare me incompetent. Cognitively declining, Margaret corrected gently. Not incompetent. There's a difference. And it's just a precaution, in case. In case what? Grace's voice was still quiet, but steel had entered it. I run 5 miles every morning. I volunteer at the library. I manage my own bills, my own life. What exactly about my behavior suggests cognitive decline? Andrew shifted uncomfortably. Mom, nobody's saying you're incompetent. We're just trying to plan ahead. Andrew. Grace looked at her son, really looked at him. Do you honestly believe I can't take care of myself? The silence stretched out. Grace watched emotions flicker across Andrew's face. Doubt, guilt, confusion. He looked at Margaret, then back at Grace. He swallowed hard. I just want you to be safe. Safe, Grace echoed. Or convenient. Margaret's hand tightened on Andrew's arm. Grace, I think you're getting upset, and that's understandable. These conversations are difficult, but Andrew and I have only your best interests at heart. We've seen how hard you've been struggling since Harold died. You've never asked me how I'm doing, Grace interrupted. Not once in 2 years have you asked me how I'm grieving, how I'm healing, what I need. You've only told me what you think I need. That's not fair, Margaret said, and now her voice had an edge. I've tried to build a relationship with you. I've invited you to dinners, to our home. You're the one who keeps everyone at arm's length. Maybe I have my reasons. Margaret's eyes narrowed fractionally. Meaning what exactly? Grace pulled out her phone, laid on the table. On the screen was a photograph. Margaret's first wedding to Richard Rothman. Margaret, young and radiant, next to a man old enough to be her grandfather. The color drained from Margaret's face. Where did you get that? Her voice was barely above a whisper. The internet is a remarkable thing, Grace said calmly, especially when you know where to look. Richard Rothman died 8 months after marrying you. Left you everything. Andrew's head snapped toward his wife. What is she talking about? It's not. Margaret's composure was cracking. That was different. Richard was sick. I took care of him. I loved him. I'm sure you did, Grace said. The same way you loved Samuel Pritchard. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Other diners turned to look. I don't have to listen to this. Andrew, we're leaving. But Andrew didn't move. He was staring at Margaret like he'd never seen her before. Who's Samuel Pritchard? Nobody, Margaret said quickly. An ex-boyfriend. Nothing important. A 70-year-old ex-boyfriend whose daughter paid you $200,000 to go away, Grace said. After you got engaged to him. 3 months after meeting him. Andrew. Margaret's voice was desperate now. Don't listen to her. She's confused. She's trying to turn you against me. Is it true? Andrew's voice was hollow. Were you engaged to someone else before Richard? Margaret's perfect mask had shattered. It's not what it sounds like. I was younger. I made mistakes. I've changed since then. You know me. You know who I am. Doi. Andrew stood slowly. You told me Richard was your college sweetheart. You said you were 28 when you married him. How old were you really, Margaret? The silence was damning. Andrew turned to Grace, and she saw it. The moment her son came back to himself. The moment he started seeing clearly again. What else? He asked quietly. What else don't I know? Grace slid the folder William had prepared across the table. Read this. All of it. And then decide what you want to do. Andrew picked up the folder with shaking hands. Margaret grabbed for it, but he pulled away. Don't, he said, and there was something broken in his voice. Just don't. Margaret looked between them, calculating, cornered. Then her expression hardened into something ugly and real. You sanctimonious old woman, she hissed at Grace. You think you're so clever, sitting in your poverty palace, judging me? You have no idea what it's like to have nothing. To have to fight for every scrap. I did what I had to do to survive. You're not surviving, Grace said sadly. You're hunting. And what if I am? Margaret's voice rose. At least I'm honest about what I want. At least I don't pretend to be something I'm not. You sit there in your thrift store dress, playing the poor widow, but I know better. I know Harold Keller wasn't some nobody. He had patents. He had a company. And you. She pointed a shaking finger at Grace. You're hiding something. I know you are. And I'm going to find it. No, a voice said from behind them. You're not. Grace turned. William Fisher stood there, immaculate in his tailored suit, and next to him was someone Grace hadn't expected to see. Diana, her sister, and next to Diana, a woman in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. Margaret Santos Rothman, the woman said, pulling out a badge. I'm Detective Sarah Vance with the Financial Crimes Unit. We'd like to ask you some questions about your relationship with Richard Rothman and the circumstances surrounding his death. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Margaret's face went from red to white. I haven't. This is harassment. We've been investigating for 8 months, Detective Vance said calmly. Richard's children filed a complaint. We've been building a case. And this morning, we received some very interesting documentation about your recent activities. She glanced at Grace, including an attempted fraud case involving power of attorney. Margaret looked at Grace, and in that moment, Grace saw pure hatred. You set me up, Margaret breathed. No, Grace said quietly. I gave you every chance to walk away. You chose this. Andrew stood frozen, the folder still in his hands, watching his wife being read her rights. And Grace, sitting in that expensive restaurant in her cheap dress, felt the weight of 3 years of pretending finally lift from her shoulders. The truth was out, but the real battle, the one for her son's soul, was just beginning. Andrew didn't come home with Grace that day. He didn't go with Margaret either, who was escorted from the restaurant in handcuffs while onlookers recorded everything on their phones. He simply stood in the parking lot, that folder clutched in his white-knuckled hands, and stared at nothing. Grace approached him carefully, the way she used to approach him as a child when he'd skinned his knee or failed a test. With love, but giving him space to feel what he needed to feel. Andrew, she said softly. He flinched. Did you know? His voice was raw. When I introduced her to you, did you already know what she was? Grace chose her words carefully. I suspected. William confirmed it. But I hoped I was wrong. You hoped. Andrew laughed, bitter and broken. You hoped, so you just what? Watched. Waited to see if your son was stupid enough to marry a con artist. The words stung, but Grace understood they came from pain, not malice. I waited to see if you'd be happy. That's all I've ever wanted. Happy. Andrew looked at her, really looked at her, and his eyes were wet. I don't even know what that means anymore. I don't know what's real. Did she ever love me? Was any of it real? Grace didn't have an answer for that. She suspected Margaret had loved what Andrew represented. Success, respectability, access. But whether she'd loved the man himself, that was a question only Margaret could answer, and Margaret's truths were unreliable at best. Come home with me, Grace said instead. Let me make you dinner. Let's just talk. Home. Andrew's laugh was sharp. Which home, Mom? The tiny rental where you've been pretending to be poor? Or the real one I apparently never knew about? There it was, the anger beneath the hurt. The rental is my real home, Grace said quietly. It's where I chose to live, where I've been happy, while lying to everyone, while finding out who cared about me for the right reasons. Andrew stared at her. That's what this was? A test? Did I fail, Mom? Is that what you're saying? No. Grace stepped closer. You're my son. You could never fail me. But I needed to know who I could trust, and I needed you to see Margaret clearly. If I told you about her past, would you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was a jealous mother who couldn't let go? Andrew opened his mouth, then closed it. They both knew the answer. I need time, he finally said. I need to think. Where will you go? I don't know. A hotel. Somewhere quiet. He looked down at the folder. I need to read this. All of it. And I need to figure out who the hell I've become. Grace wanted to hold him, the way she had when he was 7 and his dog died, when he was 15 and his first girlfriend broke his heart. But he was 35, and some pain you had to walk through alone. Call me when you're ready, she said. I'll be waiting. He nodded once, then walked to his car, that expensive, ridiculous car that looked like it belonged to a stranger. Diana appeared at Grace's elbow as Andrew drove away. You okay? I just watched my son's life explode, Grace said. No, I'm not okay. Diana linked her arm through Grace's. Come on. William's waiting. We have work to do. Back at Grace's rental house, the War Council reconvened around the Formica table. William had his laptop open, multiple screens displaying legal documents. Diana had made tea. Real tea, the expensive kind Grace used to drink before she'd simplified her life. Detective Vance had joined them, her badge now clipped to her belt. Margaret made bail 2 hours ago, Vance said without preamble. Her father posted it. $500,000 like it was pocket change. Grace's head snapped up. Her father, Jamie Santos, owns a chain of luxury car dealerships across 3 states, worth about $20 million. Vance pulled out her phone, showed Grace a photo. Ring any bells? The man in the photo was silver-haired, distinguished, wearing a suit that screamed old money. Grace had never seen him before. She told Andrew her father was dead. Grace said slowly. She said both her parents died in a car accident when she was in college. Both parents are very much alive, Vance said. Living in Connecticut. They disowned Margaret 5 years ago after the Samuel Pritchard incident. Apparently, it wasn't the first time she'd targeted vulnerable older men, just the first time it made the papers. So why did her father post bail? Diana asked. Because Margaret's pregnant, Vance said. The room went silent. What? Grace whispered. She told the judge she's 8 weeks along. Used it to argue she wasn't a flight risk, that she had ties to the community. It worked. Vance's expression was sympathetic. I'm sorry. I thought you should know before. Before Andrew finds out, Grace finished. Oh God, it gets worse, William said quietly, turning his laptop screen toward them. Margaret's lawyer filed an emergency motion an hour ago. She's petitioning for access to marital assets, claiming Andrew locked her out of their accounts. She's also requesting temporary spousal support of $50,000 per month, plus medical expenses. She's been arrested for fraud, Diana said incredulously. How can she? Innocent until proven guilty, Vance said. And she's playing the victim card hard. Young wife, pregnant, husband's wealthy family turned against her. She'll spin this as a vindictive mother-in-law trying to destroy her son's marriage. Grace felt sick. Andrew doesn't know, does he? About the baby? I don't think so, William said. The filing was just posted, but he'll know soon. Grace stood abruptly, began pacing her small living room. She'll use it. The baby. She'll use it to keep her hooks in him. Probably, Vance agreed. But Grace, you should know, we can't actually prove Margaret did anything criminal with Richard Rothman. Suspicious? Yes. Unethical? Absolutely. But the doctors all confirmed he had advanced heart disease. His death was ruled natural causes. The power of attorney was legally obtained. So she'll walk, Diana said flatly. On the murder investigation, yes. We don't have a case there. But, Vance leaned forward. What she tried to do to you? That's attempted fraud, elder abuse, coercion. If you're willing to press charges, we can make that stick. And it would destroy Andrew, Grace said quietly. His wife, arrested because his mother turned her in, and now there's a baby. Grace, you can't let her get away with this, Diana said urgently. You know what she is. You know what she'll do. I know. Grace looked at her sister. But Andrew's already shattered. If I press charges now, he'll see me as the villain. I'll lose him forever. So we do nothing? Diana's voice rose. We let her walk away? I didn't say that. Grace turned to William. The trusts. They're still secure. Locked down tight. She can't touch them. Even if Andrew wanted to give her access, which I doubt, he can't. Everything's protected until you decide otherwise. And the prenup? William smiled grimly. Ironclad. I made sure of it before the wedding, remember? Margaret signed it 3 days before the ceremony. In the event of divorce, she gets nothing except what's in their joint accounts, which, according to Andrew's last statement to me, is about $200,000. She'll fight it, Vance said, especially now with the pregnancy. She'll claim duress, claim she didn't understand what she was signing. Let her try, William said. I had 3 witnesses, 2 lawyers present, and a video recording of the signing where she explicitly states she understands and agrees to all terms. She's not breaking that prenup. Grace's phone buzzed. A text from Andrew. Did you know she was pregnant? Grace's hands trembled as she typed back. No, I just found out. How do you feel? The response took 5 minutes. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. Another text followed. She called me, crying, saying you set her up, saying the baby is all that matters now. Grace closed her eyes. Do you believe her? I don't know what to believe. But it's my child, Mom. If it's real, I can't just walk away from my child. And there it was. The hook Margaret had been planning all along. Grace would bet everything she owned that Margaret had gotten pregnant deliberately, insurance against the day her schemes fell apart. Grace typed, I would never ask you to walk away from your child, but I'm asking you to protect yourself. And to read that folder. No response. Diana was watching her with worried eyes. What did he say? Margaret called him. She's already working on him. Grace set down her phone. We need to move faster than I thought. What are you thinking? William asked. Grace was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, Margaret's playing a long game. She thinks she has time to manipulate Andrew, to paint me as the villain, to secure her position. She thinks I'm going to press charges and make myself look vindictive. You're not going to press charges? Vance asked. Not yet. Not until Andrew sees clearly. Grace looked at each of them. I need to show Andrew who Margaret really is. Not tell him. Show him. Let him discover the truth himself. Ow! Diana asked. Grace turned to Vance. You said Richard Rothman's children filed a complaint. Are they willing to talk? Vance nodded slowly. They've been trying to get someone to listen for 2 years. I think they'd be very interested in meeting you, especially if it might prevent Margaret from doing to someone else what she did to their father. Set up a meeting. Tomorrow, if possible. Grace, Williams said carefully, what exactly are you planning? I'm planning to give my son the whole truth. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, everything he needs to make an informed choice. Grace's voice was steady, and I'm going to step back and let him choose. His wife and potential child, or his own freedom and future. That's a hell of a choice to put on him, Diana said softly. It's the only fair one. Grace looked at the papers spread across her table, the documentation of 3 years of careful living and careful watching. I've been hiding long enough. It's time for Andrew to see who I really am, what I really have, and what I was trying to protect. Not just the money I was trying to protect him. And if he chooses Margaret, William asked, if the baby is real and he decides to try to make it work. Grace's voice cracked just slightly. Then I'll love him anyway, from a distance if I have to. But I won't let him do it blind. I won't let him sacrifice himself without knowing what he's sacrificing for. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Andrew. I need to see you. Tonight. Can I come over? Grace replied immediately. Yes. Come home. She looked up at her team. Her sister, her lawyer, the detective who'd been fighting for justice. He's coming here. Tonight. I need to tell him everything. Are you ready for that? Diana asked gently. Grace thought about the envelope in her drawer, the life she'd built in this small house, the truth she'd been carrying for 3 years. No, she admitted, but it's time anyway. Andrew arrived at 8 o'clock, driving a different car, a rental, nondescript and practical. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 hours. Grace had sent the others away. This conversation needed to be just the two of them, mother and son, truth between them at last. She opened the door, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Hi, Mom, Andrew said, and his voice broke on the word. Hi, baby, Grace said, and opened her arms. Andrew fell into them. This man who was taller than her now, broader, who hadn't let her hold him like this in years. He shook against her shoulder, not quite crying, but close, and Grace felt her heart fracture and mend and fracture again. I'm so lost, he whispered. I don't know who I am anymore. Grace held him tighter. Then let me help you remember. She led him inside, sat him down at the kitchen table where Margaret had laid out her trap just yesterday, and Grace pulled out the envelope from her drawer. I'm going to tell you a story, she said, about your father and me and the life we built. And then I'm going to tell you why I've been living here, in this small house, for 3 years. And then you're going to make some choices about your future. Okay. Andrew nodded, wiping his eyes. Grace took a deep breath and began. Your father was a genius. Your father was a genius, Grace began, her hands folded on the table. Not in the flashy way people think of genius. He was quiet about it. He'd spend months working on a problem, filling notebooks with equations I couldn't begin to understand. And then one day, he'd look up from his desk and say, I think I've got it, Gracie. Andrew was listening, but his eyes were distant, like he was seeing memories he'd forgotten. The first patent was for a medical device, a sensor that could detect blood clots before they became dangerous. He developed it after his mother died of stroke. Do you remember? I was 8, Andrew said quietly. Grandma Helen. I remember Dad locked himself in his study for weeks after the funeral. He was building something that might save someone else's grandmother. That's who your father was. Grace pulled papers from the envelope. That patent sold for $8 million. He used half to fund scholarships for engineering students. The other half he invested. She slid the first document across the table. Andrew's eyes widened. The second patent was for industrial water filtration, sold for $12 million. The third was for a component used in MRI machines, $18 million. Grace kept sliding papers across the table, each one a piece of the puzzle Andrew had never seen. By the time your father sold his company to MedTech Industries, his patents and technology were worth $63 million. Andrew's hands trembled as he picked up the documents. 63. Mom, I had no idea. No one did. That was intentional. Grace pulled out more papers, photographs this time. This was us in 1985. The photo showed Grace and Harold at a charity gala, both dressed elegantly. Harold in a tuxedo, Grace in a gown that looked like it cost a fortune. They were laughing, champagne glasses raised. We had the big house in Whitmore Hills, the vacation home in Aspen. Your father drove a Jaguar. I had more jewelry than I knew what to do with. Grace's smile was sad. We were living the life everyone told us we should live with that kind of money. I remember that house, Andrew said slowly. The one with the pool and the library that had the sliding ladder. You were 12 when we sold it. Do you remember why? Andrew frowned, thinking. You said you wanted something cozier, more manageable. That's what we told you. The truth. Grace pulled out a letter, yellowed with age. Your father had a health scare. A minor heart attack, they said. A warning. And while he was lying in that hospital bed, he looked around at all the expensive equipment, the private room, the specialist we could afford, and he said, Gracie, none of this matters. The only thing that matters is you and Andrew. The rest is just noise. Grace's voice thickened with emotion. So we made a choice. We sold the big house. We downsized. We started living more simply, more deliberately. We kept enough to be comfortable, to send you to medical school, to enjoy our lives. But the rest? We decided to give it away, to causes that mattered, to people who needed it more than we did. I never knew, Andrew whispered. You weren't supposed to. We wanted you to grow up normal, without the weight of that wealth shaping every choice you made, without people looking at you and seeing dollar signs instead of the person you were. Grace reached across the table, took her son's hand. It worked, Andrew. You became a doctor because you wanted to heal people, not because you needed the money. You volunteered at free clinics. You chose service over profit. You became exactly the man we hoped you'd be. Andrew's eyes were wet. Then I met Margaret. Then you met Margaret, Grace agreed. And I watched you change. Slowly at first. The volunteering stopped. You joined her father's practice. You started talking about investment properties and luxury cars. You became someone I didn't recognize. She said I deserved those things, that I'd work hard, that I should enjoy success. And she was right. You do deserve good things. But Andrew, you were already successful. You were saving lives. You were making a difference. The material things, they were replacing what actually made you happy, not adding to it. Andrew pulled his hand away, stood up, began pacing the small kitchen. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me about her? Would you have listened? Grace asked gently. You were in love, where you thought you were. If I told you Margaret had a pattern of targeting wealthy older men, would you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was a bitter mother who couldn't let go? Andrew was silent because they both knew the answer. So I made a different choice, Grace continued. When your father died, I disappeared. I moved to this house. I lived simply. I watched to see who loved me for me, not for what I had. And I waited to see if you'd notice I was struggling and come help me, or if you'd be too caught up in Margaret's world to see. That's not fair, Andrew said, but there was no heat in it. No, it wasn't, Grace admitted. But I was grieving and angry and scared that I was losing my only son to someone who only saw him as a meal ticket. So I gave you space to show me who you'd become. And Andrew, her voice cracked. You failed that test. You stopped calling. You stopped visiting. And when you finally did come around, it was to tell me I needed to be put in a home. Andrew flinched like he'd been slapped. Mom, do you know what that felt like? To have my son, who I'd sacrificed everything for, stand in my kitchen and tell me I was too incompetent to manage my own life, while his wife laid out papers to take away my autonomy. I didn't know, Andrew said desperately. I thought you were struggling. I thought I was helping. You thought what Margaret told you to think. Grace stood now, facing her son. She's been controlling you for 2 years, Andrew. Isolating you from me, from your old friends, from anyone who might make you question her. That's what people like her do. They find good men like you and reshape them into tools they can use. She's pregnant with my child, Andrew said, and there was anguish in his voice. That's not manipulation. That's real. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then, William, you can come in now. The door to the bedroom opened, and William Fisher emerged, tablet in hand. Andrew's eyes widened. What is this? Were you listening the whole time? I needed a witness, Grace said, for what I'm about to show you. William set the tablet on the table. On the screen was a medical report. Margaret's medical records, William said quietly. From 3 years ago, before she met you. Andrew stared at the screen, and Grace watched the color drain from his face as he read. Bilateral tubal ligation, he whispered. She can't get pregnant. This was done 3 years ago. Before Richard Rothman died, William added. She made the choice to ensure she'd never have children. But she said, Andrew's voice broke. She said she was 8 weeks pregnant. She told the judge. She told me. Grace pulled out another document. This is the pregnancy test she submitted to the court as evidence. William had it analyzed. It's fake, William said flatly. Store-bought positive test. You can get them online for $20. The urine sample she provided to the court was diluted with HCG hormone, also available online. But there's no pregnancy. Andrew sat down heavily, his face in his hands. She lied. About everything. Not everything, Grace said softly. I think somewhere in all of this, she convinced herself she loved you. Or, at least, she loved the life you represented. But Andrew, her love is transactional. It always has been. Andrew looked up, and his face was devastated. How did you get her medical records? That's illegal. No, William said. It's not. Not when she signed a release form as part of the prenuptial agreement, allowing access to medical records in the event of fraud or material misrepresentation in the marriage. She didn't read the fine print. Andrew laughed, broken and bitter. Of course she didn't. She was too busy planning how to spend the money she thought we had. He looked at Grace. Did she ever love me? Even a little. Grace moved to her son, knelt beside his chair the way she used to when he was small and needed comforting. I don't know, sweetheart. I think she loved the idea of you. The successful doctor, the kind man, the good life. But did she love you enough to want you to be happy, even if it didn't benefit her? I don't think she's capable of that kind of love. Andrew's face crumpled, and this time he did cry. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. Grace held him, this man who was her little boy, and let him grieve for the illusion he'd been living. When a storm passed, Andrew wiped his eyes, took a shaky breath. What do I do now? That's up to you, Grace said. You can try to save the marriage if you want. Go to counseling, hope she changes. I won't stop you. But you don't think she'll change? No, I don't. Andrew was quiet for a long time. Then what would Dad do? Grace smiled through her own tears. Your father would say that the only thing worse than making a mistake is refusing to admit it. He'd say cut your losses, learn your lesson, and move forward with wisdom instead of shame. I married a con artist, Andrew said hollowly. I let her poison me against my own mother. I became someone I don't even recognize. How do I come back from that? One choice at a time, Grace said. Starting now. What do you want, Andrew? Not what Margaret wants. Not what you think you should want. What do you actually want for your life? Andrew looked around the small kitchen, at the simple life his mother had built. Then he looked at the papers spread across the table, evidence of wealth he'd never known about, a legacy he'd never understood. I want to remember who I was, he said finally. Before all of this, I want to be the person you and Dad raised me to be. Then that's where we start, Grace said. William cleared his throat. I hate to interrupt this moment, but there's something else you both need to know. Grace, and Andrew turned to him. Margaret's lawyer filed another motion an hour ago. She's not just asking for spousal support anymore. William's expression was grim. She's claiming that Andrew has hidden assets. She's demanding a full financial disclosure, including any family trusts, inheritances, or gifts. She's also demanding access to Grace's financial records, claiming they're relevant to the marital estate. She can't do that, Andrew said. She can try, William replied. And if she succeeds, if she finds out about the $63 million, she'll go for all of it, Grace finished. The prenup won't matter. She'll claim Andrew deceived her about his financial situation, that the prenup was signed under false pretenses. She'll drag this through courts for years. And even if she loses, the publicity alone would destroy any privacy you have left, William added. Every news outlet will run the story. Secret millionnaires sont marigold digues. Your lives will become a circus. Andrew looked sick. So what do we do? Grace stood up, her mind racing. She'd been preparing for this moment for 3 years, but the reality of it was still dizzying. We go on offense, she said firmly. Before Margaret can make her next move, we make ours. William, file for divorce on Andrew's behalf. Tomorrow morning. Cite fraud, material misrepresentation, and irreconcilable differences. Mom, if I file, she'll retaliate. Let her, Grace interrupted. We have evidence she lied about the pregnancy. We have documentation of her pattern of targeting vulnerable people. We have the ironclad prenup. Most importantly, we have the truth. She looked at her son. But Andrew, you need to be sure. Once we do this, there's no going back. Margaret will fight dirty. She'll try to destroy you publicly. She'll make you the villain. Are you ready for that? Andrew looked at the medical report showing Margaret's tubal ligation, at the fake pregnancy test, at the documentation of her previous marriages. He thought about the man he'd been 2 years ago and the stranger he'd become. Do it, he said. File the papers. End this. Grace felt a fierce pride surge through her. Her son was coming back to himself. But even as William nodded and began making notes on his tablet, Grace's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You think you're clever, Grace. You think you've won. But I know your secret now. I know what you're really worth. And I'm going to take everything, starting with your son. He'll never forgive you for what you've done to his child. Our child. I'll make sure of it. Grace's blood ran cold. Another text. The pregnancy test you analyzed, the medical records you found, all fakes. I knew you'd go looking, so I planted exactly what you'd expect to find. Congratulations. You fell for it. Grace's hands trembled as she showed the phone to William. Is it possible? She asked. Could she have planned this? William's face had gone pale. If she falsified her medical records, if she planted fake evidence knowing we'd find it, then we just used fabricated evidence to advise Andrew to file for divorce, Grace finished. And if she really is pregnant, then we're about to accuse a pregnant woman of fraud, and we'll look like monsters, Andrew said, his voice hollow. The room spun. Grace had been so careful, so methodical. But Margaret had been one step ahead. Another text. See you in court, mother. Oh, and tell Andrew his father called. James Santos wants to meet his son-in-law. Apparently, we've reconciled. And Daddy's lawyers are very interested in your little fraud investigation. Something about harassment and defamation. Sweet dreams. Grace looked at her son, at William, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She thought she was the chess master. But Margaret had just revealed she'd been playing a different game entirely. Everything Grace thought she knew was wrong. And Margaret's real plan was only just beginning. The next 72 hours unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Margaret's lawyer, a shark named Donovan Price who specialized in high-profile divorces, filed a countersuit so comprehensive it made William's head spin. Defamation, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, interference with marriage, elder abuse against Margaret by Grace, claiming Grace had manipulated and controlled Andrew for years. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came on Wednesday morning when Detective Vance called Grace, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. The medical records were fake, Vance said without preamble. Margaret's lawyer just provided the real ones, certified by 3 different doctors. She never had a tubal ligation. The records we analyzed were plants sophisticated enough to fool us, but ultimately fraudulent. Grace's kitchen tilted. But how? She has a friend who works in medical records at the hospital where the fake procedure supposedly happened. They created a paper trail specifically to trap you. And we fell for it. Vance's voice cracked. Grace, I'm so sorry. but I have to drop the investigation. My lieutenant is furious. We used falsified evidence. If this goes to trial, Margaret's lawyer will crucify us. What about Richard Rothman? What about her pattern? Without the fraud case against you as leverage, his children won't testify. They're afraid of being sued. Margaret's father has unlimited resources and a team of lawyers who've already sent them cease and desist letters. Vance was quiet for a moment. You're on your own. The line went dead. Grace sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd felt so triumphant 3 days ago, and felt the walls closing in. William arrived an hour later, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. He had bags under his eyes, and his tie was loosened. Grace had never seen him anything less than perfectly composed. "It's bad," he said, sitting down heavily. Margaret went to the press. The story broke an hour ago. He showed her his tablet. The headline made Grace's stomach turn. Wealthy widow wages war on pregnant daughter-in-law. Secret millionaire accused son's wife of fraud to maintain control of fortune. Below was a photo of Margaret, looking young, vulnerable, and visibly pregnant in a flowing dress, next to a photo of Grace that made her look severe and cold. Grace read the article with growing horror. It painted Margaret as a victim of a controlling, wealthy mother-in-law who'd hidden her fortune while manipulating her son. It described how Grace had lived in poverty as a test of people's loyalty, how she'd hired private investigators to dig up dirt on Margaret, how she'd used her connections in law enforcement to launch a baseless fraud investigation. Every fact was twisted just enough to make Grace look like a monster. "There's more," Williams said quietly, scrolling down. Margaret gave an exclusive interview. Grace watched the video with mounting dread. Margaret, sitting in a tastefully decorated living room, tears streaming down her beautiful face, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. "I just want to be a good daughter-in-law," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I saw that Andrew's mother was struggling, living in that tiny house, and I wanted to help her. I suggested she let us manage some of her affairs so she wouldn't have to worry. I had no idea she was secretly wealthy. I had no idea she was testing us." The interviewer, a sympathetic woman in her 50s, leaned forward. "And when she found out you were pregnant, that's when everything changed." Margaret wiped her eyes. "Suddenly, I wasn't good enough. Suddenly, she decided I was only with Andrew for money I didn't even know existed. She hired investigators to dig into my past, to twist my first marriage to a man I loved and lost into something ugly. She used her connections to have me arrested in front of dozens of people." Her voice rose, trembling. "I'm 8 months pregnant, and she had me put in handcuffs." 8 months? The interviewer said, shocked. "But the reports said 8 weeks. "That was a misunderstanding," Margaret said quickly. "I was 8 weeks along when I first told Andrew. Now I'm 8 months. Our baby, our daughter, is due in 6 weeks. And Grace is trying to destroy our family before she's even born." Grace paused the video, her hands shaking. 8 months. She's saying 8 months now. "She produced medical records this morning," Williams said grimly. "Ultrasounds, OB appointments, everything. All certified and verified. If she's lying, she's done it with enough medical professionals that will never prove it. But 3 days ago, the medical records said she couldn't get pregnant. Those records were fake, remember? She planted them for us to find. The real records show a healthy pregnancy." William rubbed his eyes. "Grace, she's been planning this for months. Maybe years. Every move we've made, she anticipated." Grace's phone buzzed. A text from Andrew. "I need space. Please don't contact me for a while." "No, gracias Guisperth. No, no, no." She called him. It went to voicemail. She called again. Same result. She texted, "Andrew, please. We need to talk about this." The response came 5 minutes later. "You lied to me my whole life about the money. You tested me like I was some kind of experiment. You had my wife arrested. I don't know if I can forgive any of that. I need time. He's shutting me out." Grace said, her voice breaking. "She's turning him against me." "She's good at what she does," Williams said softly. "She's made herself the victim and you the villain. And Andrew's caught in the middle." Diana burst through the door without knocking, her phone in her hand, her face flushed with anger. Have you seen what they're saying about you online? It's everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. You're being crucified. She showed Grace her phone. Hashtags. Hashtag justice for Margaret. Hashtag toxic mother-in-law. Hashtag rich people problems. Thousands of comments, most of them vicious. Imagine being so controlling you destroy your son's pregnant wife. This is what happens when rich people think they're above everyone else. Poor Margaret. I hope she takes them for everything. The baby doesn't even have a chance with a grandmother like that. Grace set the phone down before she could read more. This is what she wanted. Public opinion on her side before the legal battle even begins. It's working, Diana said. Grace, I got a call from the library this morning. They're asking you to step down from volunteering until this situation resolves. Mrs. Patterson won't return my calls. Mr. Aiden's daughter came by and asked that you not speak to her father anymore. She's worried about him being associated with you. The small life Grace had built, the simple connections that had meant everything, all of it crumbling. There's more, William said, and his voice told Grace she didn't want to hear it. Margaret's father, James Santos, filed a lawsuit this morning. He's suing you personally for defamation of character regarding his daughter. He's asking for $50 million in damages. Grace laughed, a sound with no humor in it. He wants $50 million. He knows about the money now. Margaret told him. And he's not just suing you. He's filing to freeze all your assets pending the outcome of the case. If he succeeds, you won't be able to access your accounts, your trusts, anything. Can he do that? He can try. And with his resources and lawyers, he might succeed, at least temporarily. William leaned forward. Grace, I need you to understand how serious this is. If your assets are frozen, we can't pay for your legal defense. I'm working pro bono for now, but a case this complex against opponents this well-funded will need experts, investigators, a full legal team. We're looking at millions in legal fees. So I could end up broke anyway, Grace said hollowly. After all of this, after everything Harold and I built, if we don't play this exactly right, yes. Grace stood, walked to her window. Outside, a news van was parked across the street. A reporter was doing a stand-up in front of her house, probably describing the modest home where the secret millionaire pretended to be poor. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. This is just the beginning. By the time I'm done, you'll have nothing. No money. No son. No dignity. You should have just signed the papers when you had a chance. You would have kept your son. Now you'll lose everything. Margaret. Grace's hands clenched into fists. She's not going to stop. Even if she wins, even if she gets everything, she'll keep destroying me because I dared to stand up to her. Probably, William agreed. People like Margaret don't forgive resistance. Diana put her arm around Grace's shoulders. So what do we do? Give up? Let her win. Grace thought about Andrew, about the little boy who'd brought her dandelions, about Harold, who'd spent his last months making sure their wealth would be protected, about the life she'd carefully built and watched crumble in 3 days. I don't know, she admitted, and the words tasted like failure. I don't know if there's anything left to do. The doorbell rang. Grace ignored it. It rang again, insistent. Diana went to answer it and came back pale. Grace, there's a process server. And news cameras. They're recording. Of course they are, Grace said bitterly. Margaret probably called them herself. William stood. Don't accept service on camera. Don't say anything. Let me handle this. But Grace was tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of fighting. Tired of being 3 steps behind someone who'd made chess into a blood sport. She walked to the door herself, opened it wide. The cameras flashed. A young man in a suit held out an envelope. Grace Keller. Yes. You've been served. He handed her the envelope. Grace took it, looked directly into the cameras, and said nothing. What was there to say? That she'd been trying to protect her son? No one would believe it. That Margaret was a con artist? She had no proof anymore. She closed the door on the circus outside and opened the envelope. Another lawsuit. This one from Andrew. Petition for emancipation from parental influence. Grace's vision blurred. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Andrew was legally severing his connection to her, claiming she'd exerted undue influence over his life decisions. requesting the court recognize him as financially and emotionally independent from her. It was a formality, really. He was 35 years old. But the symbolism was devastating. Her son was divorcing her. "Grace," Diana said gently. "Grace, breathe." But Grace couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, the walls closing in, everything she'd fought for slipping through her fingers like water. She thought she was protecting Andrew. Instead, she'd lost him completely. The phone rang. William's phone this time. He answered, listened, his face growing grimmer with each second. "I see. Yes. I'll inform her. Thank you." He hung up and looked at Grace with something like pity. Judge Morrison just recused himself from the case. Apparently, James Santos plays golf with him. The new judge is Harriet Blackwood. Diana gasped. Blackwood? She's known for siding with younger plaintiffs against older defendants in financial disputes, William finished. She thinks wealth in old age should be redistributed to younger generations. She's written papers on it. So we can't win, Grace said flatly. Margaret chose this. All of it. She knew exactly which judges would be sympathetic, exactly how to play the media, exactly how to turn Andrew against me. We can appeal. We can. William. Grace held up her hand. Stop. Just stop. She sat down at her kitchen table in the small house that had been her sanctuary and felt the weight of 3 years of planning crash down on her. She'd been so careful, so methodical, so certain she was the smart one, the one in control. And Margaret had destroyed her in less than a week. I've lost, Grace said quietly. I've lost my son, my reputation, probably my money. I've lost everything that mattered. You haven't lost yet, Diana insisted. We can fight this. We can. With what? Grace looked at her sister. You heard William. If my assets are frozen, I can't pay for a defense. Andrew won't speak to me. The public thinks I'm a monster. Margaret's pregnant. Or she's faking it so well no one will ever prove otherwise. Her father has unlimited resources. The judge is biased against me before we even start. She laughed bitterly. Margaret was right. I should have just signed the papers. At least then Andrew would still be speaking to me. William and Diana exchanged worried looks. Grace, William said carefully. I've known you for 40 years. I've never seen you give up on anything. Maybe I'm just tired, Will. Tired of fighting. Tired of being the villain in a story I didn't write. Grace looked around her small kitchen. Maybe I should just walk away. Give Andrew whatever he wants. Let Margaret have whatever she can get from the estate. And I'll disappear. Really disappear this time. Change my name, move somewhere no one knows me. Live out my years in actual peace instead of this war. You don't mean that, Diana said. Don't I? Grace met her sister's eyes. What am I fighting for anymore? A son who thinks I'm a manipulative liar? Money that's apparently made me into everything I never wanted to be? The truth? No one cares about the truth. They care about the story, and Margaret's story is better than mine. The room fell silent. Outside, the news vans multiplied. Grace's phone buzzed with notifications she wouldn't read. Probably more articles, more hashtags, more strangers who knew nothing about her deciding she was evil. Grace Keller, who had run marathons and raised a son and loved a brilliant man and built a quiet, good life, sat in her kitchen and felt herself break. I'm done, she whispered. I'm just done. And for the first time in 3 days, no one argued with her. Grace had reached her breaking point. Margaret had won. Or had she? Sometimes the darkest hour comes just before someone finds the strength to fight back in a way no one sees coming. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, watching the headlights from the news vans paint shadows across the walls. At 3 a.m., she stopped pretending and got up. She made tea she wouldn't drink and sat at her kitchen table with Harold's old notebooks, the ones he'd filled with equations and diagrams, and, occasionally, notes to himself in the margins. The problem with most people, one note read, is they stop looking when they find an answer. Real genius is looking past the obvious answer to find the true one. Grace traced the words with her finger. Harold had written that while working on the blood clot sensor, the invention that had started everything. He'd thought he'd solved it 3 times before he found a real solution. Stop looking when you find an answer. Grace sat up straighter. Margaret's entire strategy depended on everyone accepting the obvious answer, that she was a wronged, pregnant young woman and Grace was a controlling, wealthy monster. But what if that wasn't the true answer? Grace pulled out her laptop, the one thing about her simple life that hadn't been simple. She'd kept her technology current because Harold had taught her that information was the real currency of the modern world. She started searching, not for Margaret this time, but for James Santos. If Margaret was a chess master, where had she learned the game? At 6 a.m., Diana found Grace still at the laptop, surrounded by printed articles and notes, her eyes red, but blazing with something Diana hadn't seen in days. Hope. Grace? Have you been up all night? Diana, look at this. Grace turned the laptop around. James Santos, Margaret's father, self-made millionaire, owns luxury car dealerships, claims he built his empire from nothing. We knew that already. But look at this. Grace pulled up an article from 15 years ago. He was married before, to a woman named Catherine Montgomery. She died in a suspicious car accident 6 months after they married. There was an investigation, but it was closed due to insufficient evidence. Diana leaned closer. Grace, that's... Wait, there's more. Grace clicked to another article. Catherine's family filed a civil suit claiming James had coerced her into changing her will shortly before her death, leaving him everything. The suit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. She looked at her sister. Margaret didn't learn this game from nowhere. She learned it from her father. So they're both con artists. I think it's worse than that. Grace pulled up another document. James Santos changed his name when he was 25. He was born James Samuel Pritchard. Diana's eyes went wide. Pritchard, as in Samuel Pritchard, the elderly man Margaret got engaged to before Richard Rothman. It wasn't a coincidence. Grace's hands trembled with excitement. Diana, I don't think Samuel Pritchard was a random target. I think he was family. James Santos's father. The implications hit like a freight train. Margaret was engaged to her own grandfather. Diana whispered, I think James set it up. He'd already changed his name, already distanced himself from his father. But the old man had money, about $15 million according to probate records I found. James couldn't access it directly without revealing who he was. But his daughter could. Oh my God, this is sick. It's also proof, Grace said urgently. It's proof of a pattern. Father and daughter, working together to defraud elderly people. If we can prove they conspired on Samuel Pritchard, we can show that Margaret's entire relationship with Andrew was the same con. But how do we prove it? Diana asked. James changed his name legally. Margaret could claim she didn't know Samuel was her grandfather. It's all circumstantial. Grace's momentum faltered. Diana was right. The connection was there, but proving conspiracy would be nearly impossible without someone willing to testify. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Grace almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Mrs. Keller? This is Elizabeth Rothman, Richard's daughter. Grace's pulse quickened. Ms. Rothman, I'm surprised to hear from you. I heard what Margaret's doing to you. I saw the news. Elizabeth's voice was tight with anger. I can't let it happen again. I can't watch her destroy another family while I stay silent. Detective Vance said you were afraid to testify. I was. James Santos's lawyers are terrifying, and we already lost most of Dad's money fighting Margaret in court the first time. But then I saw that interview she gave talking about her baby, playing the victim, and I realized she's going to keep doing this. Forever. To anyone who gets in her way. Elizabeth, if you testify now, they'll come after you harder than before. I know, but Mrs. Keller. Elizabeth's voice cracked. My father died alone and confused, signing papers he didn't understand, while a woman he thought loved him stole everything he'd worked for. I can't bring him back, but maybe I can stop her from doing it to someone else's father. Or son. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. What do you have? Recordings. My father had early dementia, and I was worried about him, so I installed cameras in his house. I have footage of Margaret coaching him on what to say, practicing his signature, even researching his medications to make sure nothing she gave him would show up in a talk screen. You have footage of her poisoning him? No, nothing that obvious. She was too smart for that. but I have her being calculated and cold when she thought no one was watching. And Mrs. Keller? In one video, she's on the phone with someone talking about the next target. She says, "Daddy, Richard's good for maybe $4 million after the daughter's cut." Then we moved to Plan B. Grace's breath caught. She called someone daddy and talked about a Plan B. I always thought it was weird, but I couldn't prove who she was talking to. But if you found a connection between Margaret and James Santos. It's not just a connection, Grace said. I think they've been working together for years. Elizabeth, can you send me those recordings? I can do better. I can testify. I'll call Detective Vance and tell her everything. Elizabeth paused. But Mrs. Keller, you should know Margaret's pregnancy. Did anyone verify it independently? Her lawyer provided medical records, ultrasounds, from doctors her father knows, or owns. James Santos has enough money to buy cooperation from anyone. Elizabeth's voice was urgent. When Margaret claimed to be pregnant with Richard Child, she was 52. It was impossible. She produced medical records too. Perfect records from a perfectly legitimate doctor who, it turned out, owed James Santos money for a gambling debt. Grace's mind raced. You think the pregnancy is fake? I think Margaret and her father are capable of faking anything. And I think if someone independent actually examined her, the truth would come out. After Elizabeth hung up with promises to contact William directly, Grace sat back, her mind whirring. Diana was staring at her. Is this real? Do we actually have a chance? Maybe, Grace said. If Elizabeth's testimony can prove the James-Margaret connection, and if we can force an independent medical examination. Margaret will never agree to that, Diana interrupted. She will if a judge orders it, and if we can prove she lied about being pregnant. Grace felt hope kindle in her chest. The entire case collapses. The sympathy, the victim narrative, all of it. William arrived an hour later, and Grace briefed him quickly. She watched emotions flicker across his face. Skepticism, hope, cautious optimism. Elizabeth Rothman's testimony changes everything, he said. But we need more. We need Andrew. Andrew won't speak to me. Then we find another way to reach him. William pulled out his phone. Grace, who is Andrew's best friend in medical school. Who does he trust besides you and Margaret? Grace thought. David Brennan. They were roommates for 3 years. David was supposed to be best man at the wedding, but Margaret convinced Andrew to ask her brother instead. Why? She said David was too casual for the wedding she'd planned. Andrew went along with it to keep the peace. William was already searching. David Brennan, currently practicing at County General, still in the city. He looked up. If we can get David to talk to Andrew, show him what we've found. Andrew might listen, Grace finished. He might actually listen. For the first time in days, Grace felt something other than despair. David Brennan met Grace at a coffee shop far from the news vans and cameras. He was a tall man with kind eyes and an easy smile, until Grace showed him the evidence of what Margaret had done. Jesus, he whispered, scrolling through the documentation on William's tablet. Andrew has no idea, does he? He thinks I'm the villain, Grace said quietly. That I'm trying to control him. That I had his pregnant wife arrested out of spite. David looked up, his jaw tight. She's not pregnant. I'd bet my medical license on it. How do you know? Because I saw her 3 weeks ago at a hospital fundraiser. She was drinking champagne and wearing a dress that showed a completely flat stomach. When I mentioned congratulations on the baby, she looked confused for a second before she covered and said she wasn't showing yet. David's eyes were hard. 8 months pregnant like she's claiming now, she'd be very obviously showing. And no pregnant woman's OB would approve alcohol at 8 months. Would you testify to that? William asked. In a heartbeat. Andrew's my brother in everything but blood. And I've watched Margaret isolate him, change him, turn him into someone I don't recognize. David stood. Where is he? I need to talk to him. He won't see his mother, Diana said. Will he see you? He will if I show up at his door and refuse to leave. David's expression was determined. Andrew's a good man. He's just lost right now. But he's in there somewhere, and I'm going to find him. David called 3 hours later. He let me in, David said, and Grace could hear the exhaustion in his voice. It took 2 hours, but he finally read everything. He saw Elizabeth's statement, the connection between Margaret and James Santos, the evidence of the pattern. And Grace could barely breathe. He's devastated, furious. But Grace, he's also ashamed. He said terrible things to you. He filed that emancipation petition. He doesn't know how to face you. I don't care about any of that, Grace said, tears streaming down her face. I just want my son back. He wants that too. But he needs to do something first. David paused. He's going to confront Margaret. Tonight. He's going to demand she submit to an independent medical examination. If she refuses, he'll know the pregnancy is fake. David, if he confronts her, she'll know we're onto her. She'll run, or destroy evidence, or... He knows. But Andrew said he needs to look her in the eye and ask her for the truth. He said he owes her that much, and he owes himself the chance to see if there's any part of the woman he married that's real. Grace understood. Her son needed closure. He needed to know, definitively, who he'd given his heart to. Tell him to be careful, Grace said. Tell him I love him, and tell him that no matter what happens, I'm here. I will. After David hung up, Grace sat with William and Diana, waiting to see if Andrew would find the truth, waiting to see if Margaret would finally be exposed, waiting to see if there was still a chance to save her son and stop a woman who'd spent years destroying lives. At 9 p.m., Grace's phone rang. Andrew's number. She answered with shaking hands. Andrew. Mom. His voice was broken raw. Mom, I'm so sorry. For everything. You were right. About all of it. What happened? I confronted her about the pregnancy. I demanded she take a test, a real one, administered by my colleague. She refused, started crying, said I was siding with you against her. So I told her I'd seen the evidence. The connection to her father. Elizabeth Rothman's testimony. Everything. And Andrew laughed, bitter and sharp. The mask came off. Completely. She looked at me like I was an insect. Said I was too stupid to deserve what she'd given me. That she'd wasted 2 years on a mark too poor to be worth the effort. His voice cracked. She said the only reason she married me was to get close to you. She knew about the money all along, Mom. Someone told her about Dad's patents before we even met. The whole thing was a setup. Grace's blood ran cold. Who told her? She wouldn't say. But Mom? She's not 8 months pregnant. She's not pregnant at all. She pulled up her dress to prove it. She's been wearing a fake belly. She laughed in my face and said I was too in love to ever check. Andrew's breath hitched. How did I not see it? How did I let her do this to me? To you. Because you loved her, Grace said gently. Or you loved who you thought she was. That's not a weakness, sweetheart. That's who you are. Well, why I'm almost lost everything that matters. Andrew was quiet for a moment. What do we do now? Grace looked at William, who was already pulling up legal documents, his expression fierce. Now, Grace said, now we fight back. Together. The truth was finally out. Andrew was back on Grace's side, and Margaret was about to discover that the biggest mistake she'd made wasn't underestimating Grace. It was pushing a mother too far. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, 9 a.m., in Judge Harriet Blackwood's courtroom. William had filed a motion to compel an independent medical examination of Margaret, citing new evidence of fraud. Margaret's lawyer, Donovan Price, had filed a counter-motion claiming harassment and demanding the entire case against Margaret be dismissed with prejudice. It should have been a standard procedural hearing. Lawyers arguing, judge deciding, nothing dramatic. But Grace had learned from Margaret that the best battles aren't fought in the shadows. They're fought in the light, where everyone can see. So Grace made sure the courtroom was packed. Elizabeth Rothman sat in the front row, flanked by her brothers. David Brennan was there, ready to testify about seeing Margaret drinking and clearly not pregnant 3 weeks ago. Detective Vance sat in the back, her presence alone a statement. And Andrew sat next to Grace, their hands clasped together, united for the first time in 2 years. Margaret arrived with her father, James Santos, and an entourage of lawyers that looked more like a corporate takeover than a family court hearing. She wore a flowing maternity dress, her fake belly prominent, her hand resting on it protectively. She looked radiant, vulnerable, perfect. When she saw Andrew sitting with Grace, her step faltered for just a moment. Then the mask slid back into place, and she smiled sadly, like a wounded woman facing her betrayers. All rise for the Honorable Judge Harriet Blackwood. Judge Blackwood entered. A severe woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Grace's heart sank. Everything William had said about her bias toward younger plaintiffs was evident in the way her gaze swept dismissively over Grace and settled sympathetically on Margaret. Be seated. We're here for emergency motions in the matter of Keller versus Keller and related cases. Judge Blackwood looked at William. Mr. Fisher, you filed a motion to compel medical examination. On what grounds? William stood, calm and professional. Your Honor, we have evidence that Ms. Santos has fabricated her pregnancy to gain sympathy and legal advantage. We're requesting an immediate, independent medical examination to verify. Objection. Donovan Price shot to his feet. This is outrageous, Your Honor. My client has provided extensive medical documentation of her pregnancy. This motion is nothing but harassment of a vulnerable, expectant mother by a wealthy family trying to avoid their financial obligations. Your Honor, William continued, the medical documentation provided comes from doctors with financial connections to James Santos. We have a witness who saw Ms. Santos drinking alcohol and showing no signs of pregnancy 3 weeks ago, when she now claims to be 8 months along. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of indicative. Enough. Judge Blackwood's gavel cracked. Mr. Price, I'll hear the defense's arguments. Mr. Fisher, present your witness. David Brennan took the stand, was sworn in, and testified clearly about seeing Margaret at the hospital fundraiser. His medical credentials were impeccable, his testimony calm and professional. But Donovan Price was good at his job. Dr. Brennan, how close were you to Ms. Santos at this fundraiser? About 10 feet. 10 feet. In a crowded room. At night. And you're certain she was drinking champagne? Yes, I saw. You saw a woman holding a glass. Did you test the contents? Could have been sparkling cider? Ginger ale. David hesitated. I suppose, but... And this dress she wore that showed a flat stomach. Are you an expert in maternity fashion? Are you aware that many women, especially in early pregnancy, wear compression garments that minimize their appearance? She claimed to be 8 months. She claimed no such thing to you, did she? You assumed. You made assumptions based on rumors and your loyalty to your friend Andrew, who was already in conflict with his wife. William objected, but the damage was done. David's testimony, while true, sounded circumstantial under Price's cross-examination. Next, Elizabeth Rothman testified. She described her father's relationship with Margaret, the manipulation, the coaching sessions caught on camera. But Price was ready for her too. Ms. Rothman, isn't it true that you and your brothers contested your father's will? Yes, because Margaret manipulated. And you lost that contest, didn't you? The court found your father was of sound mind when he made his decisions. The court didn't see the videos, because you chose not to present them at that time. How convenient that you've suddenly remembered them now, when there's another wealthy family to convince. Price's smile was sharp. Tell me, Ms. Rothman, has Mrs. Keller offered you any financial compensation for your testimony today? Elizabeth's face flushed. No, I'm here because you're bitter about losing your inheritance and you see an opportunity to hurt the woman who your father chose to leave his money to. Isn't that the truth? No. But again, Price had planted doubt. Judge Blackwood was frowning. Grace could feel the hearing slipping away. Then William stood. Your Honor, I have one more witness. I call Margaret Santos to the stand. The courtroom went silent. Price objected immediately. Your Honor, this is a procedural hearing, not a trial. Ms. Santos cannot be compelled to testify. She can if she wants to clear her name, William said smoothly. Surely, if the pregnancy is real, Ms. Santos would welcome the opportunity to prove these accusations false under oath. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. If Margaret refused to testify, she'd look guilty. If she testified, William would tear her apart. Margaret stood gracefully, her hand on her belly. Your Honor, I have nothing to hide. I'm happy to testify. Price looked like he wanted to strangle his client, but Margaret was already walking to the stand. She was sworn in, settled into the chair, and smiled serenely at William. "Miss Santos, you claim to be 8 months pregnant, correct?" "Yes, 8 months and 2 weeks, to be precise. And the baby's father is Andrew Keller, your husband?" "Yes." "When did you first learn you were pregnant?" "Early January, about 8.5 months ago." "And you told Andrew immediately?" "Within a week, yes." We were both overjoyed. William nodded, pacing. "You've provided medical records documenting this pregnancy. Ultrasounds, OB appointments, lab work." "Yes, all standard prenatal care." "From Dr. Patricia Hammond at West Side Medical Center." "Yes, she's a respected obstetrician. And Dr. Hammond has privileges at several hospitals owned by Santos Medical Group, which is owned by her father, James Santos." Margaret's smile flickered. "My father owns many businesses. I can't help if my doctor works at one of them." "Of course not. Just a coincidence." William pulled out a document. "Ms. Santos, is this your signature?" Margaret looked at the paper. "I can't tell from here." William handed it to her. Grace watched Margaret's face carefully and saw the moment of recognition and fear. "This is a consent form from 3 years ago, authorizing a bilateral tubal ligation. Sterilization. Is that your signature?" Price shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we've been through this." That document was proven to be a forgery planted by Mrs. Keller's investigators. "Actually," Williams said calmly, "the document Detective Vance analyzed was a forgery. But this document isn't from Detective Vance's investigation. This is from the Massachusetts State Medical Board, where Dr. Sarah Aiden filed a mandatory report after performing the procedure." He turned to the judge. "State law requires all sterilization procedures to be reported to the medical board. This is that report, complete with Ms. Santos's signature, her medical identification number, and Dr. Aiden's certification." The courtroom erupted. Price was shouting objections. James Santos was on his feet, his face purple with rage, and Margaret had gone deathly pale. Judge Blackwood's gavel cracked repeatedly. "Order! I will have order!" When the room quieted, she looked at William. "Mr. Fisher, are you saying Ms. Santos cannot be pregnant because she was sterilized 3 years ago?" "I'm saying that's what the medical board records indicate, Your Honor, which is why we're requesting an independent examination to verify the pregnancy, or the lack thereof." All eyes turned to Margaret. She sat in the witness chair, her hands still resting on her fake belly, her mind clearly racing through options. Then she smiled. Actually smiled. "You're right," she said calmly. "I can't get pregnant. The procedure was 3 years ago, after my first husband died. I didn't want children then." The courtroom gasped. Even Price looked shocked. "But I can explain," Margaret began. "You lied under oath," William interrupted. "You fabricated a pregnancy to gain sympathy and legal advantage." "No," Margaret said, and her voice was steel now. "I'm carrying a baby, just not biologically mine." Grace felt her stomach drop. "We're using a surrogate," Margaret continued, smooth as silk. "Andrew and I decided months ago. I have medical issues that make pregnancy dangerous, so we hired a gestational carrier. I've been wearing a sympathy belly to feel connected to the pregnancy, to prepare for motherhood. The baby is real. She's due in 6 weeks. She's Andrew's biological daughter, created with his sperm and a donor egg." She looked directly at Andrew. "We did this together, Andrew. Don't you remember? The clinic appointments, choosing the surrogate, planning for our daughter." Andrew's face was white. "We never—" "Check your emails," Margaret said sweetly. "Check the confirmations from the fertility clinic. Check your bank statements for the payments we made." William was already typing on his phone, communicating with someone. He looked up, his expression grim, and nodded to Grace. Margaret had created a paper trail. Somehow, she'd forged emails, bank records, maybe even bribed a fertility clinic to create false documentation. She prepared for this exact scenario. Judge Blackwood looked confused. "So, there's a baby?" "There is," Margaret confirmed. "And the surrogate will testify to that, if needed. She's carrying Andrew's child, Grace's grandchild. And yet they're trying to destroy me, to take away my child, all because I wouldn't sign away my rights to my own family. It was brilliant. Evil but brilliant. She'd pivoted from one lie to another so seamlessly that the judge looked like she might actually believe it. Then Andrew stood up. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Price objected, but Judge Blackwood waved him down. "Mr. Keller, this is highly irregular, but go ahead." Andrew walked to the front of the courtroom. He looked at Margaret, and Grace saw something in her son's face she'd never seen before. Absolute clarity. "Margaret, look at me." She did, her expression sympathetic, loving, perfect. "Tell me the surrogate's name," Andrew said quietly. "What? If we hired her together, if we planned this together, tell me her name." Margaret's smile never wavered. "Jennifer. Jennifer Morrison. Her age? 28. Where does she live?" "Boston. We chose a clinic in Boston for privacy." Andrew pulled out his phone, showed it to the judge, then to Margaret. "That's interesting, because I just called Reproductive Solutions in Boston, the only fertility clinic that uses the name Dr. Hammond put in the medical files you submitted. They have no record of Jennifer Morrison as a surrogate. They have no record of me as a client." Margaret's mask cracked. "Just a fraction. They must have made a mistake." "No," Andrew said. "You made a mistake. You prepared for people to discover you weren't pregnant. You had a backup lie ready. But you didn't count on me actually calling your bluff." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I never agreed to use a surrogate. I never hired anyone named Jennifer Morrison. I have no biological child on the way. My wife," his voice hardened, "my soon-to-be ex-wife has fabricated every aspect of this pregnancy to manipulate these proceedings." "Andrew, please." Margaret stood, reaching for him. "Don't." He stepped back. "I'm done being manipulated. I'm done being your mark." Grace watched her son face down the woman who'd spent 2 years controlling him, and felt pride surge through her. "Your Honor," Williams said, "given this testimony, we renew our motion for an immediate medical examination of Ms. Santos." Judge Blackwood looked at Margaret with new eyes, skeptical, sharp eyes. "Ms. Santos, do you consent to an examination?" Margaret looked at her father. James Santos was whispering urgently with Price. They were calculating, trying to find an angle. "No," Margaret finally said. "I refuse. This is a violation of my privacy, my bodily autonomy." "Then I'm granting the motion," Judge Blackwood said, her voice hard. "You will submit to an examination by an independent physician within 24 hours, or I will rule against you on every pending motion. Furthermore," she looked at Price, "I'm ordering an investigation into the medical records submitted in this case. If they're fraudulent, there will be criminal consequences." Price tried to object, but Blackwood cut him off. "We're adjourned. Bailiff, make sure Ms. Santos doesn't leave the jurisdiction." Margaret stood there, her perfect facade finally crumbling, and looked at Grace with pure, undiluted hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. But it was. 24 hours later, the medical examination confirmed what everyone now knew. Margaret wasn't pregnant. Had never been pregnant. The surrogate story was a fabrication. There was no Jennifer Morrison, no fertility clinic, no baby. The day after that, the FBI arrested James Santos for conspiracy to commit fraud. Elizabeth Rothman's testimony, combined with financial records Williams' team had uncovered, proved that James and Margaret had been working together for years, targeting wealthy individuals in an elaborate con. Margaret was arrested at her father's house, still wearing the fake belly, still insisting she was the victim. The media circus that had vilified Grace turned on Margaret with equal venom. The hashtags changed from hashtag Justice for Margaret to hashtag Con Artist Exposed. The reporters who'd camped outside Grace's house now camped outside the jail. Grace ignored all of it. She was too busy having dinner with her son in her small kitchen, eating pot roast and talking about everything and nothing, just being mother and son again. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Andrew said for the 100th time. "For everything I said, for the petition, for not believing you." "Stop," Grace said gently. "You were manipulated by an expert. That's not your fault. I should have known. I should have seen. She was very good at what she did. And Andrew, part of me is glad you loved her the way you did. It means you're capable of that kind of love. You just need to give it to someone who deserves it." Andrew smiled weakly. I don't think I'm ready to date again anytime soon. Good. Take your time. Find yourself again first. Grace reached across the table, took his hand. And while you're at it, maybe think about what you really want to do with your life. Margaret's father's practice. Already quit, Andrew said. That day after the hearing. I'm not working for anyone connected to them ever again. So what will you do? Andrew was quiet for a moment. There's an opening at the free clinic, the one I used to volunteer at. They need a full-time doctor, but the pay is terrible. Grace smiled. Terrible pay sounds perfect. Yeah. Andrew's eyes were hopeful, young again. You don't think it's a step backward? I think it's a step toward being who you actually are instead of who someone else wanted you to be. Grace squeezed his hand. Your father would be so proud of you right now. Andrew's eyes filled with tears. I miss him. I do too. Every day. Grace looked around her small kitchen. But I think he'd like knowing that his money is going to be used the way we always planned. For scholarships, for research, for people who need it. And for you, Andrew said firmly. Mom, you can't keep living in this tiny house. You don't have to hide anymore. I'm not hiding. I actually like it here. But, Andrew, I've been wealthy and I've been poor. And you know what I learned? Happiness has nothing to do with the size of your house or your bank account. It has to do with whether you're living authentically, whether you're surrounded by people who love you for who you are. She gestured around the kitchen. This house, these neighbors, this life, it's real. It's mine. And I'm happy here. Andrew looked at her with wonder. You really are, aren't you? I really am. Grace stood, started clearing dishes. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let all of your father's hard work go to waste. I've been talking to William about setting up a foundation. The Keller Foundation for Medical Innovation. Full scholarships for students who want to go into public health and community medicine. Research grants for devices that help people instead of just making money. I think your father would like that. He'd love it. Andrew helped her with the dishes, and they worked in comfortable silence for a while. Then, can I ask you something? Anything. How did you do it? How did you live simply for 3 years, knowing you had all that money available? Weren't you tempted? Grace thought about it. At first, yes. I'd see something I wanted and have to remind myself I was trying to live differently. But then something shifted. I realized I didn't actually want most of those things. The expensive clothes, the fancy dinners, the big house, they were just habits. Things I'd collected because I thought that's what successful people did. She dried a plate, set it in the cupboard. Living here taught me the difference between what I wanted and what I actually needed. And it turns out I need very little. Good food, a safe place to sleep, people who care about me. Everything else is just decoration. That's profound, Mom. Grace laughed. That's 3 years of early morning runs and lots of thinking. You start to figure things out when you're not distracted by stuff. They finished the dishes together, and Andrew hugged her goodnight. A real hug, long and tight and full of love. After he left, Grace sat in her small living room and felt peace settle over her like a blanket. The battle was over. Margaret and James would face justice. Andrew was healing. The money would be used for good. Everything had worked out. Well, almost everything. But there was still one more surprise waiting for Grace. One that would show her that sometimes the best endings aren't the ones you plan, but the ones life gives you when you're finally ready to receive them. 6 months later, Grace stood in the lobby of the newly opened Keller Center for Community Medicine, watching doctors, nurses, and patients stream through doors that bore her husband's name. The building wasn't fancy. It was practical, efficient, designed to serve the neighborhood where it stood, the same neighborhood where Grace still lived, 3 blocks from her small rental house. Andrew emerged from an examination room, stethoscope around his neck, that old light back in his eyes. He saw Grace and grinned, waving her over. Mom, come meet someone. He introduced her to a patient, an elderly man who'd just received treatment he couldn't have afforded anywhere else. The man shook Grace's hand with tears in his eyes. Your husband's foundation gave me my life back, he said. God bless you both. After he left, Andrew put his arm around Grace's shoulders. We saw 43 patients today, 43 people who wouldn't have received care otherwise. Dad would be. He is, Grace said softly. Wherever he is, he's proud of you. The Keller Foundation had launched 3 months ago with a gala that raised another $12 million from donors inspired by Harold's legacy. The money funded 5 full-ride medical scholarships, 3 research grants, and this clinic where doctors like Andrew provided free care to underserved communities. Grace had attended the gala in a simple black dress from her favorite consignment shop. And when people asked why she wasn't wearing designer clothes, she'd smiled and said, "Because this is what I actually like." The society pages had called her refreshingly authentic. Grace called it finally being herself. "How's the trial going?" Andrew asked as they walked toward his office. "Closing arguments start next week." Grace's voice was calm. "William says the evidence is overwhelming. Margaret and James will both be convicted." The trial had been a media sensation, but Grace had attended only twice. Once to testify, once to hear Elizabeth Rothman's testimony. She'd said her piece, told her truth, and then stepped back to let justice run its course. Margaret had tried to contact Andrew 17 times from jail. He'd blocked her number after the first 3. "How do you feel about it?" Andrew asked. "About her going to prison?" Grace considered. Sad. Not for her, exactly, but for the person she could have been if she'd chosen differently. She's brilliant in her way. Imagine what she could have accomplished if she'd used that intelligence for good instead of destruction. "You're more generous than I am," Andrew said. "I just feel relieved it's over." "Is it though? Really over for you?" Andrew was quiet for a moment. "I talked to my therapist about that. She says I'm grieving the person I thought Margaret was, and that's normal. But yeah, I think I'm finally over it. I'm ready to move forward." "Good." Grace smiled. "Because I hear Dr. Rebecca Torres has been asking about you." Andrew's face flushed. "Mom, she runs the pediatrics program here. Very accomplished, very kind, and she brings you coffee every morning. We're just colleagues. For now," Grace said with a knowing look. "But when you're ready for more than that, I think she'd be interested." Andrew shook his head, but he was smiling. "When did you become a matchmaker?" "When I realized life's too short not to nudge the people you love toward happiness." Grace checked her watch. "Speaking of which, I need to go. I have plans." "Hot date," Andrew teased. Grace's cheeks colored slightly. "Book club." "Mom, you're blushing. It's not just book club. Fine. Book club, and then dinner with William." Andrew's eyebrows shot up. "William Fisher?" "Uncle Will. He's not actually your uncle. And yes, we've been having dinner once a week for the past month. As friends," she added quickly. "Friends who make you blush." Grace swatted his arm. "Hush. We're both too old for whatever you're implying. You're 68, not 98. And I've seen how he looks at you." Grace had seen it too. The way William's eyes lingered a moment too long. The way he found excuses to touch her hand. The way he'd told her last week that she was the most remarkable woman he'd ever known. She'd loved Harold with her whole heart. That would never change. But Harold had been gone for 3 years, and William was here, patient and kind, and offering something Grace hadn't expected to feel again. Possibility. "We'll see," was all she said to Andrew. "Now go heal people. I'm going to discuss mystery novels with women who've become some of my best friends." She kissed his cheek and left him smiling in his office at the clinic that bore his father's name. Book club was at the library, in the same room where Grace had been volunteering for 3 years. The women welcomed her with hugs. Her reputation had been fully restored once the truth about Margaret came out, and the community had embraced her with embarrassed apologies. Grace had forgiven them all. How could she not? They'd only believed what they'd been shown, and Margaret's performance had been Oscar-worthy. After book club, Mrs. Patterson pulled her aside. "I'm sorry I stopped speaking to you during all that ugliness. I should have known you better." "You were protecting yourself," Grace said gently. "I understand. Well, I'm making it up to you. I'm teaching you to make my famous cookies. Sunday afternoon, no arguments." Grace laughed. "I wouldn't dare argue with you." She walked home through the neighborhood she'd come to love, waving to Mr. Aiden in his garden, stopping to pet Mrs. Patterson's cat, feeling the evening air cool against her skin. This life, this small, simple, authentic life, was everything she'd hoped it would be. William picked her up at 7 in his Mercedes that she'd once thought pretentious, but now just saw as a car. They went to a modest Italian restaurant where the food was good and the conversation was better. I talked to the judge today, William said over pasta. The foundation's tax-exempt status is approved. You're officially a philanthropist. I'm officially someone giving away my late husband's money the way we always planned, Grace corrected. There's a difference. Grace Keller, stubborn to the end. But William was smiling. Has anyone ever told you you're extraordinary? You. Frequently. I'm starting to think you have an agenda. William set down his fork, his expression suddenly serious. I do have an agenda. I've had one for about 47 years. Grace's heart skipped. William, I was in love with you before Harold married you, he said quietly. I stepped aside because he was my best friend and you loved him. And I've watched you build a beautiful life together, raise an incredible son, and navigate loss with more grace than anyone I've ever known. And Grace? I'm still in love with you. I have been this entire time. The restaurant seemed to fade away. It was just William, looking at her with 47 years of patient love in his eyes. I don't expect you to feel the same way, he continued. I just needed you to know, life's too short for secrets, and you've taught me that authenticity matters more than protecting yourself. Grace reached across the table, took his hand. I loved Harold with everything I had. I know, and I'll always love him. That doesn't end. I know that too. But, Grace said softly, I'm starting to realize that the heart is bigger than we think. That there's room for what was and what might be. And William, when I think about what might be, I keep seeing you. William's hand tightened on hers. Yeah. Grace smiled, feeling young and terrified and wonderfully alive. I'm not ready for anything dramatic. I'm still figuring out who I am without Harold. But I'd like to keep having dinners, and maybe see where this goes. If you're patient enough to wait while I figure things out. Grace, I've been waiting for 47 years. I can wait a little longer. They finished dinner, holding hands across the table, two old friends discovering they might be something more. That night, Grace sat in her small living room with a cup of tea and Harold's old notebook open on her lap. On the last page, he'd written her a note. She'd found it the day after the funeral and read it 1,000 times since. Gracie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're trying to figure out what comes next. Here's what I hope for you. Live boldly. Love fully. Don't hide yourself away. You were always the brave one, even when you didn't know it. Give the money away. Make it matter. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, let yourself be happy again. You deserve happiness, my love. You deserve everything good. P.S. If William Fisher finally gets the courage to tell you he loves you, give him a chance. He's loved you honorably for decades. That kind of patient love deserves consideration. Oh, my love, always. Harold. Grace laughed through her tears. You knew. Of course you knew. She closed the notebook, looked around her small house, at the life she'd built from grief and uncertainty and the courage to start over. Her son was healing, helping people, finding his way back to himself. Her husband's legacy was changing lives. Her community had become her family, and her heart, which she'd thought was finished with romance, was cautiously opening to someone who'd been waiting in the wings for half a century. It wasn't the life she'd planned. It was better, because it was real, authentic, hers. Grace picked up her phone and texted William. Breakfast tomorrow? My treat. The diner on 5th. His reply came immediately. I'll be there. With patience. She smiled, set down her phone, and looked at Harold's photograph on the mantel. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. For our life together, for Andrew, for teaching me that wealth isn't about money. It's about love and purpose and knowing who you are. I hope I'm making you proud. In the photo, Harold smiled back at her, forever young, forever hers. And Grace, sitting in her small house with a heart full of gratitude and hope, knew that everything, the pain, the loss, the battle with Margaret, the 3 years of simple living, had led her exactly where she needed to be. Not to an ending, but to a beginning. Thank you for taking this journey with Grace. Her story reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in authenticity, courage, and the people who love us for who we really are. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment telling me what resonated with you most. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to start over, to find yourself, or to open your heart again. And subscribe to this channel for more stories.